Wouldn't you say that Brian De Palma was the same exact way? He didn't know how to put away the toys. It was always about being on.
Yeah, Brian De Palma definitely knew how to use his cameras and certainly put it to good use in those early years, especially where he was, defining a whole new way of talking about, psychic twins and horror thrillers and it's just really exciting.
You know what's really exciting about your book and why it's so important to where we are in basically technology today is that I would love to know what Brian would do with today's technology if he had it back then, because he was taking equipment that was far too heavy, very expensive to get your hands on, and yet he made magic.
Well, I would argue that the limitations sort of force them to be even more creative.
Yeah.
And Hitchcock was the same way, when he was making silent films, he was really pushing the envelope in terms of like, how can I express things visually so I don't have too many cards to read during my silent movies. So I would say that, but Brian is a scientist, his brain, is like a computer. And I think he would today, with today's technology, he would be pushing the envelope on how to use the tools. But the thing that you have to remember that is very different from anyone else is that the tools are at the service of the storytelling. It's not the other way around. And so he thinks in terms of stories and emotions and then applies his camera language to that.
Wow. You bring up that storytelling. I mean, he was a screenwriter. He envisioned that before anything ever moved. He had to put it in words first.
Correct. And sometimes, he wrote the scripts, or sometimes, for example, Carrie is based on Stephen King's first bestseller, Carrie. And that was not written by Brian, but he worked very closely, not only with the screenwriters, but he worked very closely with his actors.
Yeah.
And there's something in Carrie when Carrie's mom dies, and obviously in the script it just said she dies. In the book, she died of Carrie caused her to have a heart attack. Mm-hmm. Well, the actor in that scene is Piper Laurie, and she said to Brian before she headed out to the bathroom, actually in between shots, she said, "What if when she dies, she loves it?"
Oh, wow.
And Brian said, "What?" And she came back and they filmed it. And you have this incredible scene where Carrie's mom is dying, but seems to be enjoying death. And it's so unique and so provocative and so memorable that it shows how open he was as a filmmaker to embrace storytelling, even when coming from actors.
Wow. I got to tell you, being a mobile DJ and doing high school dances even today, every gymnasium I step into, I think of the movie Carrie. That's the impact that movie has always had on me.
Yeah, well, I can imagine why, because something pretty scary happens at the prom night. But yeah, that's what's amazing about those films. You think about Jaws and you don't experience being in the water ever again the same way. So Carrie did to gymnasium, what Jaws did to the ocean, basically.
Wow. When you stepped into the pages of creating this book, what were you hearing inside your heart? Because, you write in a way as if you were his best friend.
Well, I write from the heart, actually. Yeah. I write from my emotions. I'm not really a scholar. I'm not an historian. I'm interested in the emotion that one feels watching a film and how it influences you and how it informs your own personality and your own artistic life, really. So, I've had the privilege of knowing Brian for many years and talking to him through the years, and it's really something that has hopefully informed this book, and that it doesn't feel like a page from Wikipedia,
Yeah.
but it feels like something that is very much of a journey for me. It was a journey. You know, I discovered a lot of things about myself and my taste and my own life watching movies. So that's what I was trying to potentially share.
You talk about having those conversations. I mean, this book has 3 decades of talks. And you know, when I go into it, I got to be honest with you. I use a yellow highlighter because I want to come back to it. Because each time I come back to a page, I get a different interpretation.
Well, thank you. That's great.
The way that you were able to put those into the storyline. I mean, it wasn't like sitting there listening to a bunch of sound bites on the newscast. I mean, you really bring us into the story.
Well, I so appreciate it because I really did a lot of work on creating a structure for the book and each chapters, you know, to be as engaging as possible and really give people a feeling that they were hearing from the people who made the films, and at the same time getting a perspective which is my own into how to watch those films so that you can have that experience over and over. You can read the book actually and just go to the quotes first, and then you can read the book and just going to my own text and getting a different perspective. So, you know, I really saw the book as something that was like clay. You know, you could experience it in different ways and over different types of exploration and reading.
Yeah, I can totally see this book being a reference book. People that are doing Hollywood stories and things like that, referring back to the book. I just want those that use your book to credit who the writer is, and that is you, and then say something about it.
Well, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, because the writers never get the credit. They'll build the story about a certain person or a place, but they don't give the writer the credit that they deserve. You did the research. You've lived the life.
Well, you know, the same thing goes with directors. Oftentimes, you know, I do a lot of films, a lot of documentary films, and very seldom is my name mentioned in connection to them. So I'm kind of used to it. You know, I take great pleasure into making and writing and making films. And then, you know, frankly, I'm on to the next thing. So I tend to not want to obsess too much about people's perception. As long as the work is out there, you know, hopefully it gets viewed or it gets read, you know, but you can't really get frustrated with that.
So many fans of movies don't really go through the experience or the journey of putting everything together. You know, we always hear of a film that it was sitting on the shelf for a little bit and then it hit the theaters. Did Brian have a movie that sat on the shelf because he just didn't feel it was it?
Well, I mean, Sisters is a good example of that. It was first shown in 1972 to the public and really didn't really have a life for a while until a distributor picked it up the following year. So that sat on the shelves and it was not a sure thing, and eventually became a cult classic. So that's why, you know, I referenced to Sisters in 1972. Because that was the first public showing, and that was gigantic. People just loved the film and were, you know, really impressed, and that sort of launched him really in that genre. But this is a film that could have sat on the shelves for a long time if it had not been picked up.
Listeners need to understand, 1972, we weren't into these gigantic complexes when it comes to theaters that have 24 theaters. We're talking about one theater, usually 300 to 500 seats. So that movie had to work.
Yeah, I think any movie had to work. But it was an exciting time. All those great directors were emerging, a new generation. And the thing that I love about that generation of filmmakers, you know, is that they were all influenced by the greats. They were influenced by Hitchcock and William Wyler and John Ford and George Stevens and so on, they knew their movie history and they loved making film, and they didn't care that they didn't have the money, or they just wanted to tell their movies. And I said tell their movies because they were telling stories in images. And you know, the next generation of filmmakers that follows them is more influenced by commercials.
Yep.
And sort of like the MTV generation, the music video clips. It's not the same. It's a different mentality. So you get movies that are that don't have the same reverence that that generation had to film history. And that's why I think De Palma, particularly, rises to the top, because he really loved cinema and did it for those reasons.
See, that's the very reason why I think Kevin Costner's Horizon didn't take off, because people don't understand the format that people like Brian put into play, that making a big epic film.
Yeah. Well, that's the struggle of every artist, and you unfortunately fall into a time where things are evolving and changing, and people's attention span, particularly new generations, is very short. So unless you speak their language in very specific terms, it's a challenge. And I think it's an educational thing. If you teach like young people whose brain is not necessarily formed to that type of language, but you really tell them a story slowly and really well, you will seduce them into a whole new world. But it's very hard to get them to even want to do that, So that's kind of the challenge that filmmakers, like you said, Kevin Costner, are facing today.
I'm the weird guy that always believed that life started with Brian De Palma. And what I mean by that is that I didn't realize that he had inspirations before him. And then to read in your book that that some people said he was a Hitchcock copy. I was offended by that, but should I be offended?
Well, I think it's like a double-edged thing, if I made a movie, I would want to be compared to Hitchcock. Okay. I wouldn't want to say you only quote from the best. But I think that the other side of that is sort of hinting at the fact that he didn't have a voice of his own, which I think is completely untrue and unfair. And I think it's an easy thing to say, oh, this movie is like Psycho, or this movie is like Rear Window. It's not. It's a next, evolution. Listen, today, what do we make? We make the exact same movie over and over. It's all sequels and prequels. Yep. And I mean, back in the 70s, The Godfather 2 and Jaws 2 were gigantic hits, but they were the first real sequels. There was no such thing as a sequel. Now it's a given. And it's not only a second, it's a third, a fourth, and, I don't know how many Fast and Furious they are, but a lot. So it's really unfair to qualify him as a copycat as much as someone who is a next generation Hitchcock, someone who borrowed from a grammar that went back to the beginning of cinema, because Hitchcock began making films, in the silent era. So Hitchcock created a grammar, and why not? Borrow from what works in terms of vocabulary. But that doesn't take away from De Palma having his own personality. And as I said, his own style. And I think he's proven that. And as people re-examine him, I think are much more generous toward him. People who appreciate him today are people who may have criticized him back then, because that was the easy thing to do,
When people come in with their own style, basically, as some people would say, you're set in your way. When they have that going on for them and they're redesigning and redefining things in the movie industry, that can also push people away. Was he hard to get along with, or did people ever look up to him in the way of saying, I like where you're going, I like what you're doing?
Well, obviously, I would say, having met and known a lot of his collaborators, everybody across the board loved working with Brian, And I even have a quote in the book of an editor who actually edited Dress to Kill, who claimed not liking his films before he worked with him and falling in love with him as he worked on the film with him, because he is really a brilliant, smart man beyond being just such a talented director. Actors love working with him. The one thing that I'll say about him, and admittedly he said that to me, he doesn't like being on set because his brain is so active and so ahead of the whatever he has to focus on, that he gets very frustrated with the length at which it takes to compose a shot and to set up lights and so on. So he's not the most pleasant person on set, I have to say, and I've witnessed that firsthand. But you have to respect the artist, and I wouldn't want to be sitting next to Beethoven when he was creating, or Picasso. I'm sure they were very difficult at the time they were creating. So you can't expect an artist to be a social butterfly while he or she is creating. But again, all of his collaborators speak so highly of him, and claim to have been influenced and inspired, and love his wicked sense of humor, and know that he can be grumpy, but he's great and a good friend.
Let's talk about you. And in the way of, we're both interviewers, we both have conversations. How did you prep for a conversation with Brian De Palma? And the reason why I bring that up is because there are many times I'll go, I'm not going to ask that question because every Tom, Dick, and Harry is going to ask that question. How did you go into your prep for that?
Well, I would say that it's a prep that took that started in the 70s. Yes. when I started watching his films. It really comes from not asking questions, but having discussions with the people you interview. For me, it's never an interrogation. I'm not looking for dirt. I'm not looking for an answer. I'm looking for a discussion. And I really come from the love or from the appreciation of the person I'm talking to. Also, I realize that I'm talking about things that are from the past and things that, Brian created in the 70s, and we're now, in 2024. So it's not easy. And so I tend to really have to prepare myself because chances are he's not watched Carrie since it came out or since he made it. As many artists, they don't necessarily rewatch their films. So to sort of generate an interesting conversation, you really have to be at the service of their own memory and be their own memory. And so that means a lot of research, reading scripts, reading articles, watching the films repeatedly, looking for clues in the film itself for things that you may not have noticed before. And it's your enthusiasm that get them excited and get them to open up and get them to talk and get them to remember, frankly, but I never approach it as an interrogation. And I take great offense, actually, when I make a film, so not a book, and I have interviews, and I tend to want to keep my subject on camera as long as I can. And people are calling them talking heads. And I'm like, what? That's a close-up. That's a close-up on someone, a talking head. That's the news. And even that is not a talking head. It's a smart journalist or reporter. So to me, when you see a dialogue in a film in close-up, you don't call it a talking head, you call it a close-up. So documentary filmmaking is about close-ups into interesting people, and at times it's been Brian himself, because I've had the pleasure and honor actually of doing some documentaries on his films, which led partly to some of the interviews that I've included in this book.
Wow. You've got to come back to this show anytime in the future. I love your vision, your storytelling, and your connection to a passion for movies.
Well, thank you so much, and right back at you.
Well, you be brilliant today, okay?
Okay, man. Thank you so much. Have a great weekend.